Brian Taylor is a professor of political science at Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs. Welcome to our program, Professor Taylor.
Good morning, Daniel. Thanks for having me.
Top commander of the Russia's Black Sea Fleet, who was in charge of bombarding civilian infrastructure in Ukraine, had been eliminated in the city of Sevastopol. What does it mean for Vladimir Putin from a political perspective?
I think it's simply, one of the consequences of the war that Russia has been waging. They've lost, quite a few commanders, up to general rank over the course of the last 2.5, almost 3 years now. And they will continue to lose them as long as they continue waging the war. But politically, I don't think it changes Vladimir Putin's goals. He's been quite insistent on those from the beginning of the war, and the loss of one officer will not deter him, the same as the loss of over 100,000 troops, has not deterred him.
Donald Trump had a phone call with Vladimir Putin. According to the Washington Post, Kremlin denies the fact of this phone call between two leaders. What is your reaction to this, and what should Ukraine expect from Donald Trump's presidency?
Yeah, the story about the phone call is really curious. Putin's press secretary, Dmitry Peskov, he lies for a living, but on the other hand, he rarely is quite so categorical and definitive about denying one of these press reports. So I don't really know what to make of it, but I do think we can assume that there will be contacts between the Trump team and, the Russian leadership at some point. In terms of what the Trump victory means for Ukraine, my own view, I'm afraid, is that the news is not great. I think that Trump has been pretty clear for a while now that he wants to see the Russia-Ukraine war ended, which many of us would in the abstract. But the question is at what cost and what would be the terms of such a deal. And I don't believe he has, the detailed knowledge of the conflict and understanding of the reasons for the war in terms of Putin's imperial attitude towards controlling Ukraine. So I fear that he will be inclined to try and push a deal on Ukraine that will be more advantageous to Russia than Ukraine. And one of the reasons I believe that is because his vice presidential running mate, J.D. Vance, sketched out a version of a possible settlement during the campaign that would largely meet Putin's goals in terms of giving Russia control over 20% of Ukrainian territory, insisting that Ukraine be neutral and not move towards NATO, and a series of other things that I think would not work to Ukraine's advantage at this point. Obviously, it's up to Ukrainian leaders and the Ukrainian country and people to decide what would be the good terms of a possible deal. But I fear that Trump will be in a rush to conclude something and be too inclined to go along with what Putin would like rather than what the Ukrainian people need.
Do you believe that Vladimir Putin would ever agree to a ceasefire in Ukraine on any kind of terms? Because it seems like he would like to move forward with his political goals and to conquer those 4 regions which were illegally annexed by the Russian government. They were proclaimed as Russian territory. However, those 4 regions are Ukrainian one.
Yes, I don't think Putin would want a ceasefire along the current line that went on for a long period of time, but he might see a ceasefire as something beneficial in the short term to allow Russia to rebuild its forces, to maybe divide the NATO alliance while the ceasefire is taking place, to maybe discourage the Ukrainian population. So I don't think Putin ever is going to settle for just certain pieces of territory, whether it's the current line of control, whether it's Crimea plus the 4 other provinces that they illegally annexed, because I think ultimately his political goal is control over Ukraine, and in some sense, the elimination of the Ukrainian nation as a separate people. I think he believes that Ukraine and Russia are bound to be together, and a pro-Western, democratic Ukraine is not something he can imagine or accept. So any acceptance of Putin of a ceasefire, I think, would be a tactical decision to play along with the Trump administration, but I don't think it would be the end of the Russia-Ukraine war, because ultimately his goals go much beyond even the territory that Russia currently occupies.
How do you see the recent main goals of Vladimir Putin and his regime right now regarding Ukraine and also Europe?
Well, I think his main goal, the overarching one and the reason for the war, I've already stated, which is political control over Ukraine in some fashion. I think in the short term, he is determined to both expel Ukrainian forces from the Kursk region and to extend Russian control over the Donbass, Donetsk, and Luhansk regions. The Russians have been throwing massive amounts of troops into those battles, suffering massive casualties, but they keep throwing more and more at it. So I think that's where they're focused most of all now. But this is only a temporary goal in pursuit of the larger goal. And those goals haven't changed with respect to Ukraine. In terms of his goal with respect to Europe, I think it's pretty clear that he wants a divided Europe. He wants one that's divided from the United States, which I think becomes more likely under a Donald Trump presidency. And he wants a Europe that's divided amongst itself, because this is a really challenging moment for Europe, whether it can come together, unite, and find the capacity to take over the main role in helping defend Ukraine, because it's uncertain under a Trump presidency whether the United States will continue to play that leadership role.
Is there a chance that Donald Trump can go after Vladimir Putin, can confront him if Putin refuses to make a deal on any kind of terms?
I think there's certainly a chance of that. I mean, Donald Trump is a pretty unpredictable political figure, and he often changes his moves. The national security team he's putting together is quite diverse, with some people who I think would be more inclined to want to stand up to Vladimir Putin, and to some people who'd be more inclined, to try and cooperate with Putin. So I think it's possible that if Putin refuses a ceasefire, that Trump will do what some people have suggested, which is give Ukraine even more weapons more quickly, try and flood world energy markets with oil and gas to try and drive down the price of those and weaken Russia's position. That is certainly possible. But I would always come back to the point that Donald Trump seems to admire Vladimir Putin, has never really had a bad word to say about him. Took Putin's word over U.S. intelligence agencies about Russian interference in the 2016 U.S. presidential election. So I wouldn't want to put a whole lot of hope that that would be the direction that Trump takes. I think it's more likely that the direction he takes will be one in which the U.S. is stepping back from supporting Ukraine and moving on to other priorities.
From your perspective, how can you assess Trump's national security team? We have heard new reports about Marco Rubio as a candidate for U.S. Secretary of State, and also Mike Waltz could be a next U.S. National Security Advisor. We also, there were some reports about the new Defense Secretary, about Fox anchor. What is your assessment of all of these candidates, and how can they shape Trump's policy on Ukraine?
Yes, it's a really interesting question, and of course it's still in flux. I would say from the point of view of Ukraine that Rubio as Secretary of State and Waltz as National Security Advisor would not be the worst outcome by far. And at various times, both of them have been pretty, what we in the U.S. would call hawkish, or direct towards Russia. On the other hand, both of them voted against the last assistance package for Ukraine, which was passed back in April. So we would have to see if they would create a group within a future Trump administration that's pushing for standing up to Russia and continuing to help Ukraine, or whether they will be, taking the direction that J.D. Vance wants to go, which seems to be saying we don't really care what happens in Ukraine. And the new nominee for defense secretary apparently is someone who really doesn't have any kind of experience in running such a large organization as the United States Department of Defense. So I think at best you would say it would take him some time to figure out the role, and at worst you would say he's not really qualified for that position, which I think is concerning at a time when the U.S. has important defense responsibilities in Europe and Asia and elsewhere around the world.
And what is your take on the role which could have Elon Musk in Trump's administration?
Yes, the role of Elon Musk is very curious. There was a front page story, in the New York Times today talking about Musk's very elevated role and being at Mar-a-Lago and being around Trump and his family, fairly constantly, also being put in some position about a new commission on government efficiency. Based on what Elon Musk has said on his social media platform, Twitter or X, he's very much skeptical of the U.S. position of helping Ukraine. I know Starlink has played an important role in Ukrainian defense, and that should certainly be acknowledged. But at least if we read what he says online, he also is in the camp that we see in the Republican Party now, at least half of the Republican Party, that thinks Ukraine should not be a priority. So we'll have to see if he has Donald Trump's ear on this issue, or if other advisors, can persuade Trump that the path of the U.S. continuing to stand by Ukraine, sticking up for its territorial integrity and sovereignty, for international law, against, an aggressor nation committing war crimes, if that's going to continue to be the U.S. position, or if we're going to see a change. My guess is we're going to see a change, unfortunately, which I personally would disagree with, but elections have consequences.
Do you feel that Donald Trump would take the opinion of his advisors seriously, or he would only act on his own?
Well, in the first Trump administration from 2017 to 2021, early 2021, it was the case that people such as H.R. McMaster, National Security Advisor, or John Bolton, or General Mattis or General Kelly, who was at Department of Defense or Chief of Staff, oftentimes were able to talk Trump out of some, certain foreign policy steps. For example, it's been reported that Trump on several occasions suggested the U.S. should pull out of NATO, and his advisors managed to talk him out of that. We'll have to see what the dynamic is in a second Trump administration. My fear is that he will trust his instincts more, that he will surround himself more with yes men who will go along with what he wants rather than challenge his positions if they think they're wrong. So I'm afraid that his impulses will play more of a role in the second Trump administration than the first one. But again, it remains to be seen. And there may be people like Waltz and Rubio who can continue a more traditional Republican foreign policy of standing up for democracy around the world. We'll have to wait and see.
What do you personally expect from Donald Trump in case of NATO and European security?
Well, I think this has to be a real concern for people, because we know that in his first administration, he talked several times about withdrawing from NATO. It's been clear really for a long time that he doesn't understand how the NATO alliance works. He seems to see it as some kind of protection racket in which countries pay the United States for defense. So he's constantly talking about those countries that haven't paid us enough. which of course is not how it works. It's simply a threshold for a percentage of a country's economy that they are supposed to spend on defense. And I would note that most NATO member countries are now meeting that 3% threshold. But I think, if we look at what Trump has said, that those countries that don't, quote unquote, pay, he will tell Vladimir Putin to do whatever the hell he wants. I think that's a very worrying prospect, because the NATO alliance depends on unity. It depends on every country being willing to come to another country's defense. And so I think that's a big point of concern going forward.
Do you feel that Europe is ready to replace American support for Ukraine, military and financial one? Do you see such political will from European leaders?
I think that's probably one of the biggest questions for Ukraine going into 2021. And we have encouraging signs from some countries. Poland in particular, I would say, has been very forceful on this issue. President Macron of France has at times been very forceful on this issue, although the amount of aid has not always been up to the rhetoric. I think the United Kingdom is also quite strong on this issue. And we'll have to see what happens in Germany, where, of course, new elections are coming. And depending on who wins that election, we might see a stronger attitude on the part of Germany as well. So I think there are important discussions happening right now. Will Europe be able to stand up and replace what the United States has contributed in the military sphere? But even if there is that consensus, it will take some time. It takes a while, to build the defense plans, to place the orders, to spend the money, to agree to the various steps they might take to reinforce Ukraine's defense. So there could be a transition period in which eventually the Europeans do stand stronger and do manage to replace the U.S. role if the U.S. Steps back under a Trump presidency. I think that's probably the key issue to watch as we move into 2021, at least in terms of outside the context of Ukraine itself and Russia itself.
I would like also to cover Kremlin and Vladimir Putin. What is your take on current Putin's grip on power?
I think his grip on power seems to be quite secure as far as we can tell. He's been in power 25 years now. Leaders of that type, a personalist dictator who've been in power that long, of his age, they tend to survive politically. And we don't really see any space for either elites who might oppose him or for mass protests. We just had the case this week of a pediatrician sentenced for over 5 years in prison simply because of something she was alleged to have said to a patient in a private conversation. So the repression continues against anyone who speaks out against the war. And I think many of the Russian elites, regardless of what they thought about the war initially, now see no other alternative to Putin. So I would say his position is quite strong at the moment. The question is, will they be able to manage some of the pressures on the economy in terms of the labor shortages, in terms of inflation, in terms of supplies, and will they be able to manage the personnel needs? Because Russia has had 600 to 700,000 casualties, dead or wounded, since the beginning of the war. They're having to increasingly pay people more and more money to get them to sign these contracts to go off and be sent into the meat grinder at the front. So there are pressures on Russian society and the Russian economy, but at least from where I sit, it doesn't look like those pressures will have any kind of immediate effect that would destabilize Putin's grip on power at the moment.
How could Putin's departure from his office look like from your perspective? How could it end for Vladimir Putin?
Well, honestly, the most common way for a leader like Putin to leave power is when they die. When you're a personalist dictatorship that's had that grip on power that long, they often stay in power till they die. If we look at other cases of regimes like his regime around the world, that's the most common scenario. But sometimes it happens that either some kind of popular uprising or some kind of elite conspiracy can unseat a leader like that, especially if they make, a really grave mistake that endangers their hold on power. We saw the Prigozhin mutiny in the summer of 2023 that came out of nowhere. It looked for a period of about 24, 36 hours that things were very unstable, and then Putin managed to work his way out of that. But things like that can, occasionally happen in that type of system where everything depends on one person at the top. The information they receive is often unreliable, and we don't know what his subordinates are thinking. So there are those scenarios, but at the moment, the thing that's most likely to end a Putin, presidency, a Putin rule in Russia is his death. And we have no reason to think that that's imminent at any point. He's 72 years old. He seems to be in decent health as far as we can tell. So I wouldn't expect, some kind of change in the Kremlin anytime soon.
But how can you assess current mood in Kremlin after the US general election? Are they happy or sad about this development, Donald Trump's victory and Republican majority both in House and Senate?
Well, as far as we can tell, the Russian political elite and political, rulers are more or less happy about this outcome, while at the same time being a bit cautious and a bit wary. We know for a fact, because of things that happened during the campaign, that Russia intervened in the election on the side of Donald Trump. That's been well established by the U.S. government and the U.S. media. But on the other hand, the Russians remember that they thought Trump would do certain things during his first presidency that didn't end up happening. And he actually did some things that they objected to, such as agreeing to supply Ukraine with Javelin anti-tank weapons and tightening the sanctions on certain individuals in, the Russian political and economic elite. So they are somewhat hopeful that they can pursue their objectives with respect to Ukraine, with respect to Europe, more successfully under a Trump presidency. But they're also taking a very cautious line at the moment because they have this attitude that whoever is president in the United States, they always seem to be anti-Russian from the Russian point of view. And so they're going to wait and see what happens and who takes the top positions and what direction they take U.S. foreign policy under Trump.
Thank you, Professor Taylor, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Thank you, Danielle. It was a pleasure to be here.